experience is the Christian moves to the left politically. They begin to take the Bible less seriously. I've never seen someone become more liberal socially, politically, while becoming more solid theologically. Biblical inerrancy seems to give way to cultural relevance. Now, immediately, we emphasize the reality that biblical inerrancy is a small minority view. I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think it's vitally important. I've lectured on this for a long, long time. I know all the reasons that people use to reject N.T. Wright calls it that stupid American doctrine. I get it. I understand. But it is a minority view. And that tells you much more, not in church history, but in the current context. That's where you have a difference between church history as an overview and the current context in our current situation. But I really want, especially my audience, to know where you really are, because I've seen a lot of people stumble when they discovered that what had been a given in the entirety of their Christian life wasn't a given outside of the narrow range of their religious experience. And I've seen people really bothered when they came to understand that. And part of it was because they thought we were saying the opposite of that. They interpreted the teaching and preaching of their church as communicating to them that all Christians believe as we believe on these issues. Especially in the fundamentalist context, that's exactly what is being said. If you disagree with this entire spectrum of issues, then you're just clearly not a Christian. So some people are saying that. And then I try, but we don't do a generally really good job in defining the parameters of the faith, in defining where to draw the lines. We struggle a little bit with that. Okay, so there's what Allie Stuckey said. I saw a few people responding to her, but this was the response I specifically wanted to focus on. And it's from Jamar Tisby. And Jamar Tisby says, this statement comes from a version of Christianity hermetically sealed, one might say, segregated from the rest of the Christian body. The entire Black church tradition refutes her myopic assessment, and the sentiment is dismissive of countless Christians and their faith. So I wanted you to see that so that you could see exactly what Jemar Tisby had to say. Now, why should we worry about what Jemar Tisby has to say? Well, for those of you who don't remember, Jemar Tisby was not sure whether he was the founder of or one of the primary movers of RAN, the Reformed African American Network. And we first made reference to RAN probably off the top of my head, 2017 maybe. I'm thinking that's when the issue with the young Black man that was flipping off the cops, and as he walked in front of my car in traffic, and I wrote a 500 some odd word, basically paragraph on Facebook, and the place blew up because I mentioned fatherlessness and I mentioned rejection of authority and things like that, and everybody just had a cow. And that was I think 2017, if I recall correctly. It was about a year before the MLK 50 stuff. And then the Reformed African American Network transitioned into the Witness. And if anyone has been following, I was sort of wondering, is this why Jamar responded to Allie Stuckey? Because he sees himself in her words. Because he's got to know that where he is today, where he was 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. And if you recognize that, then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what has changed and why? I'm not one of those people that says, well, if you're not exactly where you were 30 years ago, then you're just a terrible, horrible compromiser, et cetera, et cetera. No, there is room and necessity of growth for all of us. And the real issue is, what about the foundations? What about the very core of the faith. And the problem is the left-right split is normally focused upon core issues, upon the issue of inerrancy, upon the issue of inspiration, upon what external sources you're going to allow to have a tremendous impact in how you think about the faith. There are conservatives who have the influence of external sources and don't know it. I've talked about it before in regards to fundamentalism. Fundamentalists will say, remember what Dave Hunt said to me? James, I have no traditions. That was one of the clearest examples that you could ever have of someone who has a tremendous amount of traditions, but has no way of examining those traditions, no way of critically analyzing those traditions, because of this overarching presupposition that I don't have traditions. I only believe what's in the Bible. Well, that's a noble sentiment, but if you don't actually practice it through meaningful methodologies of exegesis, it's a great way to smuggle in your traditions and always do it under the basis of allegedly the scripture. So the person on the right wants to affirm sola scriptura and the sufficiency of scripture and tota scriptura, the entirety of scripture. The person on the left knows. Now, when you first start down that road, you may not want to admit this. You may want to try to stay away from it. But eventually, you wake up one morning and you go, I'm really seeing the Bible very differently than I used to. And you have to ask yourself the question, why? Where is this going to lead? And so I think that was behind maybe Jamar hearing an echo of something about himself. So when it says this statement comes from a version of Christianity hermetically sealed, one might say segregated from the rest of the Christian body. Well, so you have someone congratulating himself about how broad he is and what, this is great. And when remember the emergent church stuff? A lot of people don't necessarily remember the emergent church stuff. It was a big splash for a while. It for just about as long as, what was that prayer? Prayer of Jabez. Did you ever pray the prayer of Jabez? No, you didn't. We got you before then? Good. I'm glad. Anyway, the emergent church was a bunch of fundamentalists who came to realize that a bunch of the things they believed as fundamentalists really weren't representative of what the apostles taught. But what they did is they then threw out all of church history. Threw out, as in throw out, not threw out the other through. So we need to come up with a different word there. Anyway, they got rid of church history and basically said, all right, let's just put it all on the table and let's reevaluate everything from the Trinity on up. So it was the proverbial baby with the bathwater type thing. And I get the mindset. I get coming to realize that you need to be free to examine what you've been taught. There's always has to be a balance, no question about it. But what happens with people on the road to the left is they see themselves heading that way, but they don't want to be honest themselves as to exactly what the driving motivating factors are. Because if they're really honest themselves, they know my big thing is this social issue. And I am starting to change my perspectives so that I can be more focused upon this one social issue. This is the thing. That's why I believe one of the greatest signs of Christian maturity is that you realize that balance is the great key to obtaining Christian maturity. That you're not looking for the one huge lightning bolt from heaven that's all of a sudden going to enlighten you about it. Not it'll light you up, get a lightning bolt from heaven, but enlighten you and give you all that maturity and things like that. But you realize that the great challenge you're going to have throughout your Christian life, even into your older years, is to remain balanced. And balance requires an understanding of what is foundational and definitional to the faith, and what is important, and then concentric spheres going out from there. And where you can draw that line as to what's absolutely necessary. And then the space between that and where someone enters into a damnable heresy, which you can't always draw as nice and neatly as you would like. And just because one of your great heroes, the faith, drew it at some point doesn't mean that you necessarily have to do the same thing. For example, I don't recommend whatsoever the shooting of Unitarians or the burning of Unitarians, but I can still learn from people who, in their context, thought that was the necessary way to go. Now, by the way, what I just said is the very attitude toward history which is currently under full-scale assault in our society. And if you're willing to destroy the monuments that have stood there for hundreds of years, then obviously you're going to be very willing to engage in the editing of the written text of history as well. We should be very, very well aware of this and protect our history. I'll talk a little bit more about that maybe a little bit later. Anyway, so there is a balance that is to be had. We want to stand firm on the foundations of what Scripture teaches without taking that to the point where my personal interpretation of all these things becomes absolutely mandatory for everybody else, and everybody else has to agree with me on everything. And everybody falls somewhere in that spectrum. And so what I'm saying is maturity is requiring you to think through, why am I here and not over there and not over there? Could I go to that church over there? If I couldn't, why? But if a friend of mine goes over there, can we have Christian fellowship, even though I couldn't be a part of that church? See, these are things that we should be thinking through, but very often we don't. And so Jamar Tisby is a smart guy, and so he uses language in a very specific way. So when he says that this comes from a version of Christianity hermetically sealed, one might say segregated from the rest of the Christian body. Well, that sounds really wise. And it touches on a note that we can recognize as being important. And that is, we know people who are in a hermetically sealed, segregated form of Christianity. Now she's not, and saying what she said is not that, but in so much as certain fundamentalists could say what she said, then you can make that kind of a statement. Obviously, she actually has a much wider exposure to beliefs and perspectives. So she knows that she's representing a purposefully conservative aspect of things and is trying to make a specific point. But once again, hidden in the statement from Jemar Tisby is the sort of the presuppositional push that says the Christian body includes almost an unlimited variety of expressions. And I'd be really interested in seeing how Jemar Tisby's interpretation of what the Christian body is has changed over the last 10 years, or maybe only the last 6 years. I think culturally, Ferguson was a turning point. It was a turning point for a lot of people. I think it was a turning point for Thabiti Anyabwile. I think it was a turning point for Jamar Tisby. I think it was a turning point for Anthony Bradley. And maybe faster or slower, depending on the individual, but I think that's where a lot of this began. And so I would love to be able to compare the Jamar Tisby of 2010 with Jamar Tisby of 2020 and ask questions of each that would shine a light on just what has changed and why has it changed. But then the care of the first sentence gives way to the lack of care of the next sentence. The entire Black church tradition refutes her myopic assessment, and the sentiment is dismissive of countless Christians and their faith. Now, I don't see how those two clauses are actually overly logically related to one another. There's two different assertions being made there, and one of them is really strange. The entire Black church tradition refutes her myopic assessment. So the entire Black church tradition. Maybe the only way I'm trying to hear what Jamar Tisby was saying. Maybe what he's saying is that the entire tradition has moved to the left. I mean, because we know that the Republicans and the Democrats go all the way back to the time of the Civil War. And we know the Democrats were in the South and the Republicans were in the North. And we know who freed the slaves, and it wasn't Democrats. And we know who started the KKK, and it wasn't Republicans. And we know who voted for the Civil Rights Act, and it wasn't Democrats. And so we know the history. And yet the Black tradition, quote unquote, is in the left, much more to the left than it is to the right. But I would immediately be offended if I was any one of a number of Black friends that I have. And this is why my Black friends who would oppose what Jamar Tisby says can simply expect to, in essence, be excommunicated from the Black community, or what we would call the Black church tradition. Because there is a very strong desire to have a monolithic group, a monolithic representation. And so my experience is when Vody or Sandal or could name a number of other guys write something and say something, you know, the Just Thinking podcast that goes against the flow of the leftward narrative in the Black church, the terms that are used of them are terms that fundamentally deny their reality as a Black person. So who was it? Eric Mason. Eric Mason at, it was either the T4G thing or the MLK thing. I forget, it was 2 years ago now. They were really close together. In his comments, talked about Black men who are Black on the outside and Anglo on the inside. Now, there's a term that is used for that. He didn't use that, thankfully, in his talk, but it is used very, very regularly in public discourse and social media. And I see it used all the time in a very racially insensitive fashion. But one of the big problems I have is that when you teach an entire group of people that they are not capable of committing a particular sin, that's the best way to make sure that sin is going to be committed. And if you tell an entire people you cannot be racists, that helps to foster racist attitudes. If racism is a sin, then all of Adam's children are subject to that sin. If you say that it's only a power structure thing and all the rest of that stuff, you've completely lost the biblical categories. You're out in the woods someplace. which is where we are right now, to be honest with you, for everybody. But it's not the entire Black church. It's not a refutation of her assessment. In fact, if anything, Jemar Tisby is sort of the living example of exactly what she was saying. And then to say the sentiment is dismissive of countless Christians and their faith, well, again, her statement wasn't about defining their Christianity. Her statement was an observation of the allowance of external sources to come in and they come in and create lenses through which you then read Scripture. And you end up changing the message of Scripture in the process. This is what leftism has done and is doing in our day. And so I wanted to comment on that, not only in defense of what Allie Stuckey had said, but then to unpack that so that we have an understanding and idea of why someone who once had the ability to argue that he was a conservative, reformed ministerial student, why he would be where he is now. What are the parameters? What's going on there? That will help us to understand a lot of things that are happening in our land right now.